Good afternoon. Welcome back. I think we'll begin our session. This final panel is on innovative solutions for European integration, which of course is the title of the entire conference. So we're basically building upon the preliminary things that have been discussed. We already have had some ideas about innovative solutions, and we're going to continue on that path. It seems that there is a consensus that the EU accession process offers the best hope for the future of the Western Balkans, based on the successful transition of Central and Eastern Europe, and also the hope of replicating the peace that has been established on the continent between old enemies such as France and Germany. The problems come up, too, that the EU accession process, by its nature, involves both very rigid constraints and a lot of complexity. And this, through the constraints that we've had previous panelists discuss them, what Wade referred to as a rule-based approach, a sort of a legalistic approach, and it seems, as Ambassador Grdesic alluded to, it's becoming more and more legalistic as time goes on. The complexity is apparent also in the presentations that we have listened to already. There are so many levels on which the international community is now operating in the region, and this seems to be such a big burden because it's so difficult to balance and coordinate all of the different levels in which the international community is working on. And it seems impossible to predict outcomes so simply. But this complexity may also be able to provide us with some keys for adjusting the current policy on the Western Balkans. So this last panel is going to sort of focus on several of these keys in terms of targeting international cooperation on specific problems in the region and addressing them, and sort of working on certain things to pull the region out of its current stasis. Our first speaker, Elena Jileva, who is currently at the Center for Political and Constitutional Studies in Madrid. We're very happy she came such a long way. She's going to discuss something that has been much discussed today and in Washington for several years now, on visa facilitation as an instrument for EU conditionality in the Western Balkans. Thanks, Elena.
Well, I'm very glad to be back at this institution that hosted me as a junior public policy fellow many years ago. My paper is going to try to narrow down the strategies that the European Union can present towards the Western Balkan countries by focusing on one particular issue that throughout the conference has been pointed out to be very sensitive and salient for these societies, and namely the visa liberalization procedure that has started basically since the Thessaloniki summit in 2003. Within the context of the strength of EU conditionality that has been discussed, I would like to argue that instead of focusing on a comprehensive approach that will lead to the ultimate reward, which will be membership, the European Union has an instrument to provide intermediate rewards in terms of free visa regime that will bring tangible benefits to the peoples of the Western Balkans, and in a sense support further their further support for reforms that need to be taken in order to achieve the goal of membership. So within this framework, I would like to analyze how exactly the visa policy can function and what reforms it can bring about. First, what I would like to say is that the visa liberalization per se is envisaged in two steps. First, the visa facilitation, which means that the visa obligation is still there, but the procedures are facilitated. And then a second step is the visa liberalization per se, that is going to lead to free movement of people from the Western Balkans. Let me begin by saying why the visa is so important for the Balkan societies. I won't go much into it, but because of the audience here, but it's we need to understand what obstacles it presents. It creates feelings of exclusion and isolation in these countries, and then it fosters resentment and anti-EU sentiments in the Western Balkan populations, and in turn it decreases the willingness of the politicians and other public figures to describe themselves as pro-European. And that's why on every occasion, high-level officials, including Boris Tadic during the second round of his presidential elections, first thing that he did going to Brussels was asking about visa liberalization. And in a sense, not making progress along these lines undermines the efforts for support of pro-EU politicians. On the other hand, the problem with the visa policy is that, in a sense, as it exists, it stops law-obeying and legitimate travelers who need to go through the process, but it's not a deterrent mechanism for criminals and traffickers who are, in the opinion of the Europol's director, Jürgen Storbock, they are operating in a united space. So just briefly say that for Serbia, since visa was imposed in 1991, it's become serious issue, especially because of, according to some studies, 75% of people under 25 years of age have never traveled abroad, and they are deterred by the cumbersome and expensive process of application for visa, which is related to the following. First, you don't have enough consulates all over the country, and then the number of documents are difficult to get. They have to be translated, and although the European Union is presenting has common consular instructions, there are still differences in how each consulate treats applicants. And at the end of the day, it is the visa issuing is at the discretion of the officer. The visa issue prevents the visa issuing procedures prevents people from even trying to apply for a visa, and in many occasions they decide in terms of business trips or participating in conferences, they decide not to apply. Similar disenchantment with this visa obligation exists in Kosovo, where again a big study was conducted, where also the prohibitive visa fees were one of the reasons for fewer people applying at all. I go in my paper through the political sensitivity of the issue in Macedonia and in Albania, and in a sense, what unites all the Western Balkans in their resentment to the existing visa regime is that actually we are now observing a generation, as Milica was saying, of young people who have never left the country, which some would argue sort of is linked to the sharp rise in nationalism among young people who were not able to travel abroad, and this is different from the generations of their fathers who during the Cold War were allowed to travel to the West. So we have a reverse situation from the one that was in the case of Bulgaria and Romania. So the conditions, I would argue, for visa facilitation and ultimate liberalization are directly linked for justice and home affairs reforms in the European Union, and not to other rewards and reforms, because the justice and home affairs area is now part of the common community under common community law, and it's also where issues such as migration, asylum, and border controls fall into. So in this way, when the Western Balkan countries are asked to apply with the justice and home reforms, they are asked to do so because these reforms will be needed by them when they start eventually negotiations for memberships, and they will be part of the acquis. So they have double significance. First, as an instrument, as a condition for removing the visa regime, and second, as part of the larger plan of implementing complying with the negotiating chapters. The reforms that need to be done relate to illegal migration and also to eliminating threats to public order. And the link between visa lifting and justice and home affairs reforms, as I said, was mentioned in the Thessaloniki summit, and then the European Commissioner for Justice and Home Affairs, Franco Frattini, he also linked the liberalization with signing of readmission agreements that are part of the broader strategy of the European Union for combating illegal migration, adopting in Tampere in '99. So basically, also in the previous other countries, the readmission agreement has been, the signing have been crucial for allowing for visa liberalization processes to proceed. Within this process of complying with performing reforms, the Western Balkans have set up an initiative which is called MARI, the Migration, Asylum and Refugee Regional Initiative, which means that they are collaborating into dealing with issues such as preventing illegal migration, adopting new strategy for asylum and visa policy. So in a sense, this individual desire of each country has been also put together collectively to contribute towards the liberalization of the visa regime. The reason that I make forward this argument is that the case of Bulgaria and Romania, which until 2001 and 2002 had a visa regime, is successful in terms of bringing the necessary reforms, because a lot of political internal energy and institution building have been put into implementing the EU regulations that relate to law for personal data protection, law for foreigners in the Republic of Bulgaria. The identity documents have been changed, and the whole country, basically all the institutions, were involved into changing their work towards implementing the new rules. And the Justice and Home Affairs issue crosses different ministerial agencies, such as the visa approximation is done at the Foreign Ministry. Then passports are issued from the Interior Ministry. And this has been done in Bulgaria in 1997, which was the most dramatic economic crisis for the country, and that created different domestic priorities. And it is interesting to stress that rather than focusing on other urgent issues, the Bulgarian government at the time put its effort into complying with the EU standards. I say this in order to argue that for the Western Balkan countries as well, although there are so many other issues on the table, this prospect of visa facilitation and visa liberalization can mobilize the general public and politicians. For the Western Balkan countries, the isolation is felt even more strongly now with the enlargement, the previous two rounds of enlargement of the European Union, because when the 10 new countries joined the European Union, they had to comply with the EU visa list. And in that sense, the Western Balkan countries were isolated from another 10 countries in Europe. So we're talking here about expanding non-entry space for these countries, because before individually countries could maintain their bilateral relations, such as Bulgaria was keeping free border with Macedonia. Now that the border is closed, Macedonians are applying for Bulgarian citizenship in great numbers that destabilizes the country in many ways. And in that sense, also it's a question between Serbia and Hungary, and in that sense, the problem seems to be intensifying. What has been the response of the European Commission? Indeed, from in 2007, the visa facilitation and readmission agreements have been signed. We have an increased funding for justice and home affairs projects within the CARDS program, and some more concrete measures towards visa facilitation. For example, the agreements reduce the visa fee from 60 euro to 35 euro. Also, there is a commitment for visas to be issued within 10 working days. So these are tangible results that at least make the procedure less cumbersome. Finally, the way after the signing of this agreement, the European Union has provided roadmaps in a document from 2008, Western Balkans Enhancing the European Perspective, that these roadmaps contain clear benchmarks to be met by all countries in the region, which will also provide input in the issue. So it will be not only unilaterally. And these roadmaps covered document security, illegal migration, public order, and security, and as well as technical assistance to support their implementation. The latest developments are that in April, a group of 8 new members plus Italy, the foreign ministers again stressed the need for visa liberalization. Macedonia is in talks, according to which maybe by the end of 2009 the visa regime will be lifted. The Commission is screening the progress towards meeting the standards, and according to the measures taken for other countries, visa liberalization will come into being, while the steps in the meantime are going to be through the visa liberalization. And finally, the European Parliament as well expressed an opinion about enhancing the European perspective for visa-free movement in the Western Balkans. So just to conclude, the argument here is that an intermediary reward, visa facilitation as an intermediary reward, can maintain the process of integration of the Balkans countries into the European Union, despite the fact that it will be a long, drawn-out process anyway. Thank you.
Thanks, Elena. Our next speaker is Sharon Fisher, who will speak on boosting EU integration of the Western Balkans amidst the global downturn, as if it wasn't hard enough. We'll try now. Sharon Fisher is a senior economist at IHS Global Insight. She's also the author of the book Political Change in Post-Communist Slovakia and Croatia, From Nationalist to Europeanist. So she has the excellent dual background of both understanding economics and understanding the EU accession process as it worked in Central and Eastern Europe. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nida. It's a pleasure to be here again. As Nida mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on the impact of the current global crisis and how it will affect the Western Balkan region. So just to start out, the current global crisis really has highlighted the benefits of EU accession for the Western Balkan countries. These countries have 3 main policy options at the moment. These include regional integration through such organizations as CEFTA, secondly, closer ties with Russia, and thirdly, integration into the European Union. Of course, these are not mutually exclusive. To some extent, you have to participate in regional integration programs in order to get into the EU. And in regard to Russia, of course, Russian energy is it is the main source of energy for these countries, if not the only source. So there is some degree of cooperation that is needed with Russia. However, as we saw with the January events, diversification of the energy sector would really be a good idea for these countries to ensure a steady supply. And just to add, I mean, I talk about this more in the paper. I won't get into it now, but in terms of setting up a business-friendly environment, cooperation with Russia is not necessarily a good thing for these countries, and it could actually hurt them in terms of integration with the EU. And I'll show you a little bit more about that later as we move on. All of the Western Balkan countries state EU accession as the main foreign policy goal. However, in recent years, the leaders of several of the countries have made overtures toward Russia, especially in regard to, especially in the case of Serbia and Montenegro. And Montenegro is now seeing the downside of that in regard to the situation with the CAP aluminum plant. The Balkan countries, as has already been mentioned earlier today, the reforms that are recommended by the EU and the IMF have been slow, and it would be good to use this crisis as a way of boosting this reform process and encouraging the countries to make more progress in this area. And the current crisis does serve as a crucial reminder that there is more to be gained from cooperation with the EU and IMF. Of course, the case of Hungary and Latvia show that EU membership doesn't protect countries from economic hardship. However, being in the EU is clearly safer than being outside. From an economic perspective, one of the key arguments for moving forward with EU integration is the trade patterns. If you look at the export breakdown for these countries, all of them, except for Kosovo, the majority of their exports go to the EU. And only a very, very small percentage of exports go to Russia. I have to add a note that the figures for SEFTA are estimates because not all countries give the breakdown, and I had to sort of add things together and figure them out that way, but they should be fairly accurate, those figures. So the global crisis is clearly having a very adverse impact on the Balkan economies. Initially, the region seemed to be relatively well protected. All of these countries have a low level of export dependence on, export dependence, period, which allows for decoupling. So I think a lot of the countries, when they were doing their budgets for this year, they expected to have a reasonable rate of economic growth, and that's turning out to not be the case, and most likely. The risks are rising sharply this year, and financing the large current account deficits will be especially complicated. Along with the crisis, we've seen a dampening of inflows of foreign direct investment as Western companies have to use their resources differently, and they're not expanding so rapidly as they have been in recent years. We also see more expensive foreign lending. This is further impacted by the sovereign risk downgrades that some of these countries have already gone through, and there will be more downgrades in the months to come. We're also seeing, as was already mentioned today, declining inflows of workers' remittances. A lot of these countries rely very heavily on remittances from citizens working abroad, and in this global crisis, those very people might be the first to be laid off in the country where they're working. So this situation will be further complicated if they go back to their home country and claim some kind of benefits, social benefits. Another risk relates to the potential outflow of capital from the banking sector, which is largely foreign-owned in the region. And just to show you in a couple of graphs about the situation, this graph shows the level of export dependence for most countries in the region, including, the Western Balkans and the new EU member states. And you can see that of all the Western Balkan countries, Macedonia has the highest level of export dependence. This includes both goods and services. And just a side note is services includes tourism, which is why you see relatively large shares for Croatia and Montenegro. But a lot of these countries they have very low levels of export dependence. But one negative thing is that they have very large current account deficits on average. This is largely due to their trade deficits because imports in recent years have far exceeded exports. Montenegro had a current account deficit estimated at almost 30% of GDP last year, which is quite huge. And a lot of these deficits are financed by inflows of foreign investment, but it's also been accompanied by rising foreign debt, which you see in this slide, that external debt levels, while they're lower on average than some of the new member states, they are quite high for the level of development in the Balkan region, and it's something to look out for. You have, like the new member states that are healthier, like Slovakia, Czech Republic, and Poland, and they all have lower ratios of external debt to GDP than Croatia, Serbia, and Montenegro. So what we've seen in recent months is the Western Balkans are slowly starting to realize that they are being deeply affected by this crisis, and they have to do something quickly and decisively to help resolve the situation. And they're slowly starting to turn to the IMF for assistance. Serbia was the first one to move forward on that front. The IMF approved a loan to Serbia in January already, but that will be replaced by a much larger loan, which is now in the process of being approved. Bosnia, they just reached an agreement yesterday on a loan worth $1.5 billion, which will require serious budget cuts, especially in the Federation. And other countries are likely to follow. This may include Croatia and Montenegro. I think it will partly depend on the tourism season. And if tourism is not so terribly affected by the global crisis, then they might be able to pull through without an IMF loan. But I think Montenegro in particular will have big difficulties this year, partly because of the CAP aluminum plant, which the government is having to intervene and to make sure that it doesn't fail altogether. Amidst the current crisis, the governments are forced to accept budgetary limitations that would have otherwise been impossible. The IMF has been more lenient with them in the past. Like in the case of Serbia, they're allowing a budget deficit of 3% of GDP, which is quite high by IMF standards. Still, the loan does require fiscal responsibility and serious budget cuts, which the Serbian parliament, I believe, already approved, and Bosnia will probably have a difficult time approving them, but I think that everyone realizes that they don't have another choice at this point. Even those countries without IMF deals will have to make cuts to maintain macroeconomic stability because foreign lending is not much of an option at this point. And just in terms of the ideas of this conference, it occurred to me that this situation really creates a unique opportunity for the international community to step forward and cooperate and to work together to help resolve these problems and to push forward a new framework for reform in these countries that would, push these countries toward EU integration more rapidly. And this could be true not only in the economic sense, but also political. And those coordinating policies in this regard would help to boost growth and protect the region from further crises. So just to get an idea of where the countries of the Western Balkans stand right now, the latest data from Eurostat indicate that in 2007, the GDP per capita in the Western Balkans was far below that of the new member states. Croatia is the only one that's close, and Croatia is ahead of Romania and Bulgaria, but still below the average for the 8 countries that joined in 2004. And then the other Western Balkan countries are quite far behind. So one of the obvious ways to boost GDP in these countries is by attracting more foreign business, foreign investment, which has worked very well in the case of countries like Slovakia. So, in order to attract more business, more FDI in these countries really have to make more progress in creating a business-friendly environment and fighting corruption. And if you look at, I did these comparisons on 3 different indices, and the Index of Economic Freedom from 2009 puts the 10 new EU member states from Central and Eastern Europe. They scored an average of 67 points, which puts them in the moderately free category, whereas the Western Balkans were quite far behind at 58 points, which is mostly unfree. And just to give you an example of where Russia stands, it's at 50.8, which is mostly unfree, bordering on repressed. And you can see a similar pattern with the World Bank's Doing Business report and Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. So it's really important for the Western Balkans to try to raise their scores in this area and become more attractive to Western businesses. So just to wrap up, I wanted to say that the new EU member states really provide an excellent case for reform in regard to the Western Balkans. On many issues, such as tax policy, the EU doesn't dictate a specific reform path. So the Western Balkans can really choose from a number of different approaches that have already been tried in the new member states. And these have achieved varying degrees of success. Some of the star performers in the international rankings from the last slide that I showed, such as Estonia, which generally ranks as the top or one of the top of the whole region in those rankings. Some of those countries have been quite hard hit by the current crisis. But then Slovakia, which adopted the euro in January, is one of the best performers economically, although it is being hit this year by the downturn in external demand. It shouldn't have any long-term consequences. So yeah, just the Western Balkans do have that advantage in being able to select whatever policies have worked best in other countries, and including looking at the impact of the current crisis and which countries have fared the best. Clearly the road ahead won't be easy, but with further cooperation among the international community, and that could help push the Western Balkans along. Clearly the lack of a common voice only creates confusion and encourages resistance. And fortunately, the next panelist is from the World Bank, and so he will be able to go into more depth about how the World Bank will resolve these problems in the region.
Thanks, Sharon. You did indeed give us a great intro to the next panel that will sort of move the focus even closer to the nuts and bolts of the policies that are being driven by individual institutions in the region. Our next speaker is Anthony Gaeta, who is Senior Country Officer in the Western Balkans Department of the World Bank. And he'll speak on fostering stronger cooperation between institutions, the World Bank's role in the Western Balkans. Thanks very much for coming.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. Sharon covered a lot of the issues I would have talked about, so I'll keep it short, and I'll just give an overview of the bank's history in these countries, what we're doing, what we had planned to do, looking forward on a path to EU accession, and then how we're dealing with the crisis. I'm going to be short for a couple of reasons. Sharon covered a number of things. 2, I got the invitation to come just a bit ago, and 3rd, I've only been working in the region for a short bit, and as I figured would happen, I realized how much I don't know about the place the more I learn about it. So here I go. The bank has quite an interesting history of involvement in the Balkans. by the time the wars ended, it was difficult. It was a difficult involvement because of the level of borrowing that the former Yugoslavia had done in the 80s, which left these countries very highly indebted to us and to other multilaterals. But we were involved in Bosnia even before the war ended, and their membership actually dates back to 1993 because we were involved with the authorities outside of the country and then in the country even before the war ended. Macedonia became a member in 1994, Serbia and Montenegro in 2001, and then again in 2006 separately. Kosovo will become a member very soon. They're about to become a member of the IMF today or tomorrow, or very soon, and then the World Bank will follow in a few weeks, so we're looking at early June for Kosovo membership. I'll also talk about Albania. The way we split up these countries in the bank is Croatia belongs to a separate country unit that includes Bulgaria and Romania and Hungary and so on. And you say, why? Sharon talked about it. The Albania, Bosnia, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia, per capita GDP is about 30% of the EU 27, and Croatia is well above it, at above 50%. So we try to keep the countries in some kind of a classified unit. But over our total exposure, the amount of money we've committed to these countries over this period from '94 to today is about $4.5 billion, and $2.8 billion of that is from the IDA window, which is the International Development Association. That is the concessional window that lends at essentially no interest rates and very long maturities. So it's been very good money for these countries. From the very beginning, the bank has played an important role in the transition countries. Dating back to 1998, we spelled out our cooperation in an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, with the EC and the EIB and the EBRD. And we added other sub-regional development banks later. We've worked with the EU on what role we could play in making sure that the bank assistance could ensure effective, the countries would ensure use of EU structural and cohesion funds. We understand the importance of the acquis, that sets the overall tone for EU accession, and that the EU and the countries are in the driver's seat, and we're trying to support it. We work very closely, our economists work very closely with the EBRD and the EC and the fund and the EIB on the country analyses, so we're all on the same page as we go forward, ensuring that our analysis and our programs and our conditionality is helping move these countries forward to membership. This memorandum of understanding was made explicit for the Balkans in 2005 to put a bit more attention on these Western Balkan countries on the path to Europe. I mean, the main message here is that no country strategy, which is how we design our lending, is developed or is supported by the board without a major component being, or the major component being, how does it help these countries get to EU accession? I can skip a bit on the, a year ago or a couple of years ago, as we were looking forward to these, how we support these countries. The whole idea was these countries are moving away from the bank. They're going to move away from the fund. A few of the countries had paid back the fund, and they're on their way to the EU. In fact, it was not a great career decision up until about December of this year to join the ECA region, the Europe and Central Asia region, particularly these countries, because they were on their way to Europe. So the issues over the last couple of years were how do we ensure continued macroeconomic stability to get them so by the time they join Europe, they're competitive. They'll be able to thrive as part of Europe. The countries were all growing at 5 or 6%. Macedonia was a little slower, but they were beginning to accelerate as well. But there were weaknesses, and there were some vulnerabilities that really started to show up as the crisis started to hit. They had Current account deficits, as Sharon talked about, grew from about 4% of GDP in 2000 to 9% in 2005 to sort of the low teens. Today, Serbia was 18%, Bosnia is 14%. Major vulnerabilities by the time the crisis comes. Over the last few years, the surge in commodity and energy prices played a part, but really it was weaknesses in their export capacity. So one way to look at it is the average of these countries' exports to GDP is 39%. You can compare that to Hungary, which is about 70%, 69%. So the way we've looked at how we support these countries is how we had been until November, at the turn of this year, how we make them more competitive. And this is where I can talk a bit about, where we've been focusing our lending. Infrastructure is a major problem. The infrastructure that was destroyed during the war, or infrastructure that was just left to lag. The workforce is very high wage and low skilled, and it made them vulnerable to Asian exporters and others. And of course, governance has been an issue. Let's take a few minutes to talk about the role we're playing in infrastructure. In some countries, that's what we do. I mean, in Macedonia, 50% of our lending has been for infrastructure. In Serbia and Bosnia, it has been 20%. It's going to be even higher. We have an interesting, I guess our legacy in Bosnia suggests the role that we can play. After the war, 2/3 of the homes were damaged, 20% were destroyed. Half the population had no water supply, electricity, and coal were at 10% of pre-war levels. It was a mess. And 10 years later, slightly more than 10 years later, Bosnia had rebuilt infrastructure back above pre-war levels. The bank played and the international community played a major role in that, and it has been a driver of growth in Bosnia since then. Region-wide, sub-region-wide, we are looking at a major area is transportation, road construction and rail and urban transport, and even the restoration of the waterways. We have and here again, we're trying to use these investments to encourage regional cooperation with the EU and within the sub-region. So we're working on a Sava River waterway rehabilitation project, which requires some demining, and try to get that back up where it can get back to its capacity of moving freight the way it had been. In Serbia, we're about to finance a major this Corridor 10 road network that is going to link Serbia with EU and candidate EU countries, with Austria in the north and Macedonia in the south. It's really going to help Serbia take advantage of its place in southeastern Europe in the center of a central position there. Energy integration, energy, we're playing a major role as well, particularly through the Economic Community of Southeast Europe. We're about to finance a major project in Bosnia that is going to help with dam safety. It's going to help reduce the adverse environmental impacts of thermal power stations, replace aging facilities, and help reduce sulfur dioxide or nitrogen oxide emissions from these plants. So infrastructure has been a major area, but not just in a discrete way, but trying to figure how we work on these infrastructure investments that link it with the EU and the rest of the region. Second major area is basic human capital. About 15 to 20% of bank support goes to health and education and social protection. The countries have made a lot of progress. Poverty has fallen by half in Serbia over the last 6 or 7 years. Bosnia, it's fallen by substantial amounts, 6 or 7 percentage points. Albania, slightly less, about 5 percentage points. Macedonia, it's been a bit tougher, but the more the countries are making the investments and the more that we can support them in the international community, we're starting to see payoffs. Our work tends to focus on 3 basic areas. In social protection, we're really interested in coverage and targeting. Is the money really going to the poorest quintiles in the country? In some places, in Bosnia in particular, there's been a tendency to target some of these very important monies to not so much at who are the poorest, but if you are a war veteran and you belong to a powerful lobby, it's not targeted the way we'd like to see it. Now, as Sharon was talking about, we're beginning to see some movement. We just had our spring meetings, and we were in Bosnia about a month ago talking with the finance minister, particularly in the Federation, and they're seeing this in the way that either President Obama or whoever it was who said, don't let a good crisis go to waste. This is a chance to face off against the lobbies inside of Bosnia to fix this fiscal trap that they're in, because if they don't fix this, they'll never be able to move forward on the broader agenda. Healthcare, we're interested in working on, again, making it more efficient, moving from an input-based to more of an output-based, based by patient services to again, reduce the fiscal costs and improve the quality of health. We have projects in every one of the countries that we work in. Education, in most countries, it's working on quality and reorienting the educational system. I mean, I was struck when I first came that in Serbia, for example, 60% of students go to vocational schools. So when you start to look at these regional, European-wide and regional-wide tests that they do on educational outcomes, the countries in the Western Balkans don't do so well. Other areas we're working on regional, trying to find regional, intra-country regional integration. There are places within countries that have really lost out and not been able to keep up with the regional integration that the countries have been making. In Serbia, it's been in the areas, mining areas, that once privatization came, whole areas that used to have very high employment are now suffering. So we're trying to help with finance small and medium-sized enterprises, worker training programs. In Macedonia, we're working on an interesting conditional cash transfer program, the kinds that you've heard about, I'm sure, in Brazil and Mexico, where we're actually paying, families are being paid if the kids are going to school and getting health checkups. And again, governance, of course, is a major agenda item. Complying with this acquis, this 80,000 pages of the EU laws and regulations, takes some administrative capacity. So we're trying to work with institutions in the countries. Some of the country strategies that we have have what's called a governance and anti-corruption filter, or a way to link disbursements of the bank's money to real efforts and real outcomes on transparency and accountability. We're financing a very interesting judicial reform program in Serbia that's beginning to identify where politicization is undermining judicial outcomes. Finally, I can go slow. I can go quickly here on this was our plan up until the fall. The crisis hit a little later than it did in other places, but the Central European region has been hit harder than any other region in the world. Sharon touched on some of the reasons. There was a lot of vulnerabilities. I talked about the fiscal imbalances, the high debt levels, some 60% of GDP. Sub-region-wide, their debt levels, which compares with 20% in Mexico, 35% in Russia, 16% in Brazil. Their countries are 75% of the banking system is foreign-owned. None of the countries had any fiscal space to undertake stimulus programs. They were in poor shape on social protection. As I said, the targeting is not good. High level of remittance, 50% in Bosnia, 15% of GDP in Albania, 13%. I mean, that's a substantial amount of money that people count on every month on remittances. We have a good idea that in these countries we can expect poverty rates to increase by about 12% for every 5% decrease in GDP growth, and that's what we expect to see in these countries. So the social hit is going to be very substantial. Sharon talked about the IMF programs. We're working really closely with. One of the concerns was these countries start undertaking important institutional reforms in Serbia on pensions and and Bosnia on the social spending. And then what tends to happen is they get involved in a fund negotiation for a standby, and they need to really compress even more and lose some of the quality of the reforms. So we do something called a public expenditure review, where we're working very closely with the fund on these programs. So we hope that we'll see less of an impact that we might otherwise have seen. Another positive development has been all the foreign-owned banks. As soon as these countries make an agreement with the fund, all the major foreign-owned banks get together with the World Bank, the IMF, and the European institutions to establish an agreement to maintain exposure. So there was a huge fear beginning in November, December that the Raiffeisens and many of these unit credits would start pulling their money out of Serbia and Bosnia and some of the other countries. They have agreed not to do that. It's not a binding agreement, but it is a step forward. So the cooperation being organized in Europe in which the bank is participating suggests that things can be better than we might have expected. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony. Our next speaker, we're going to shift gears here, but again, sort of focusing on specific problems within one country, Bosnia, and refer to a problem that Gulnur raised in her session on state building versus member state building, and Bruce Hitchner will talk about constitutional reform in Bosnia and Herzegovina and European integration. Bruce is the head of the Dayton Project, which has been working on constitutional reform for quite some time, and he's also a professor at Tufts University. Thanks very much, Bruce, for coming today.
Thanks, Nita. I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak here today at what I think has been a very interesting conference for a lot of reasons. European officials have repeatedly stated that constitutional reform is not a prerequisite for Bosnia and Herzegovina's integration into the European Union. Strictly speaking, this is correct. Constitutional reform is not and should not be an objective criterion for EU membership. But in staking out this position, the EU, in the interest of preserving the overall integrity of the integration process, and because it has precociously and with good intentions entered into an SAA agreement with Bosnia, is compelled to finesse the obvious fact that Bosnia is not in a position to meet many of the essential criteria for EU integration. This is because its current government, reflecting its deep ethnic divisions, is not functionally or appropriately configured to do so. This policy dilemma for the EU has the unfortunate indirect consequence of forestalling urgent government reform in Bosnia, which can only be changed through negotiated amendments to the Dayton Constitution. To be fair, European officials contend that the conditionality attached to the integration process and the lure of the benefits accruing to the BIH of Bosnia from the EU membership should and will inevitably motivate Bosnian political leaders to carry out the necessary government reforms without the potentially cumbersome and divisive necessity of a constitutional reform process. In principle, this is laudable, and the recent history of EU integration in Central and Eastern Europe certainly commended it as a strategy. But Bosnia is significantly different from all previous and potential EU candidate countries. Specifically, it is a state whose integrity, sovereignty, and constitutional structure have been contested repeatedly by all significant segments of its own citizenry, its constituent sub-state structures, and even neighboring states, both in war and since the 1995 internationally imposed and enforced Dayton Peace Agreement. BIH is thus not a modern state born out of self-determined, and that's my allusion to Wilsonian visions, cooperation and compromise and a shared national will to unify. Until there is a sense of shared national identity, identity, and I think this is unlikely in this generation, or more likely, constitutional identity, it is audacious for the EU to presuppose a political predilection within a state and institutions whose very existence is contested from within to respond with any clarity of purpose or enthusiasm to soft conditionality related to membership in a post-national community of states. If the EU is committed to membership for her sovereign and integral Bosnia, it must proactively assist the country to achieve a sense of common national purpose that goes beyond a purely functional emphasis on encouraging and facilitating EU-compatible bureaucratic structures, mechanisms, and institutions. Bosnia cannot and will not coalesce as a state by merely taking on the outward appearances of a modern European state. The will to statehood must come from within, and in the absence of a shared sense of national identity, the only way forward will be through the fostering of a sense of constitutional patriotism by a constructive constitutional reform. In inviting Bosnia to become a member of the EU, Brussels has, whether it likes it or not, taken on the responsibility to make Bosnia whole, and constitutional reform is the remedy for doing so. In this sense, the connection between constitutional reform in Bosnia and European integration is fundamental and, I suggest, indivisible. To that end, the EU should not only support constitutional reform, but a permanent, i.e. uninterrupted process that allows it to move forward without delay. In this regard, calls for postponing, for example, the constitutional reform discussions by the three major parties until after the 2010 elections should be resisted. As foreseen as well as unforeseen events do not improve the chances for future success on constitutional reform, and in fact only impede the latter by providing numerous occasions for delay or breakdown. The same holds true for the oft-used but spurious argument that the next election may provide better political leadership. The EU and US must be prepared to deal with the leaders that are elected, not the ones it wishes. It is, of course, one thing to say that the EU should support constitutional reform in Bosnia, and wholly another to say how it should do this. The first step must be for both the EU and the United States to declare that in the particular case of Bosnia, constitutional reform is a necessary step a preliminary step in the EU accession process. The shift in policy should be based on the following premises: that Bosnia does not have stable institutions guaranteeing democracy, fiscal stability, and is at risk of political stagnation and even instability. 2, that both Bosnian state institutions and the entities lack the appropriate range of competencies, as well as a sufficiently integral working relation in respect of one another to function effectively as a constitutionally stable state, thereby rendering Bosnia incapable of complying with the complex conditions and requirements of EU accession in the near or medium term. The EU and the United States should not mince words on this issue. For far too long, the dialogue on constitutional reform has been dominated by a myopic and frankly overly simplistic view of what can and should be done to resolve the country's problems of governance. Bosnia is a very complex society with profound challenges in the heart of Europe. It is also a state that lies on the frontier of and seeks entry into one of the most complex unions of developed modern states in the world. Bosnia needs a constitutional government that is competent and sufficiently sophisticated at every level to handle all these challenges. Solutions calling for a loosely structured, minimalist state government, including a weak state government, are, if not naive and self-serving, certainly a disservice to the needs and challenges that face the citizens of Bosnia now and for the foreseeable future. In any event, at the very least, the straightforward declaration and diplomatic weight of a shift in EU-US policy toward Bosnia asserting the importance of constitutional reform and its direct connection to EU integration would, in and of itself, give new momentum and legitimacy to the semi-dormant constitutional reform progress, and that would be difficult for Bosnian politicians on all sides of the spectrum to ignore. I don't wish to get into a discussion here of what further steps or modalities the EU or US should or could take in terms of a direct or indirect engagement in a renewed constitutional reform process. Rather, I shall focus in the remainder of my presentation on approaches to constitutional reform that could sidestep some of the problems that have plagued constitutional reform negotiations and public debate to date, and lead to government reforms that truly set Bosnia on a path to political stability and EU integration. Up to now, approaches to constitutional reform have been directed almost entirely to building viable state institutions. But viable state institutions in Bosnia depend first on the stability, functionality, and relational cohesiveness of the sub-state structures. At present, the Republika Srpska and the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, jointly or individually, suffer from a deficit of political, economic, and administrative parity and compatibility, problems of functionality and corruption, and an unbalanced relationship to an underdeveloped state government. Entity government stabilization and development is therefore a necessary prerequisite to building a functioning state government. Now, some will protest vehemently that we should do away with the entities altogether. Yet, however much we may feel deep disquiet over the circumstances under which the entities came into existence, they are here to stay for the near and probable medium term, and until all sides agree that things should be different. And since they are here to stay, a more forward-looking strategy should be to make the entities functional, accountable, wholly democratic, and capable of meeting their fundamental mid-level government responsibilities. As one woman once remarked over her unhappy marriage, if you can't change the man, change the man. Hence, the EU and US should encourage renewed constitutional reform discussions to focus initially on stabilizing the entities and their relationship to one another. Such an approach has two merits. First, it promotes political balance. Bosnia cannot afford a significant imbalance in the powers of the entities. The division of the federation into two or more entities in particular would likely lead to an outsized Republika Srpska, which would be politically unhealthy over the long term. Secondly, while some have suggested that the entities be broken into smaller units of up to 5, Bosnia is not yet stable or secure enough in its shared sense of identity to undertake such a massive reorganization at this time. It's for the same reason, by the way, that I would argue against eliminating the entities now. Such changes might be possible in the future, but they are more plausible beyond the time frame necessary to move Bosnian integration. Beyond the time frame necessary to move Bosnia's integration into the EU forward. Now to specifics. In the case of the Republika Srpska, stabilization means reaffirming the current state entity in exchange for its for both entities' compliance with an EU-appropriate agreed subsidiary relationship to the state in terms of competencies without the right of succession. The starting point in the definition of the subsidiary relationship between the RS and as well as the Federation and the state could be the draft list of competencies or a version thereof which the Dayton Project has drafted and shared with the major political parties. This draft list, which has been vetted by the European Commission for Democracy through Law, also known as the Venice Commission, is a substantial upgrade and improvement of the, quote, responsibilities of and relations between the institutions of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the entities laid out in Article 3 of the Dayton Constitution. The proposed competencies in the Dayton Project draft list are normative and in line with those shared by state and sub-state entities among EU members. If adopted by the RS and the Federation, these competencies would allow both to retain a sufficient degree of a substantial degree of local governance. With respect to the Federation, constitutional reform should aim at resolving its deep structural problems, especially its excessive layers of government. Stabilization discussions with the Federation should be directed at reducing cantonal authority and correspondingly strengthening the responsibilities of the Federation and the municipalities. Agreement should also be reached on reducing taxes and the number of beneficiaries of social benefits and simplifying business procedures for business startup. In sum, fixing the entities makes sense not only as a prerequisite in building an EU-compatible state government, but also because it reduces both the number and intractability of the problems relating to constitutional reform at the state level that have made all prior debate and negotiations almost intractable. Difficult. It follows then that the key to building competent functioning state institutions is to recognize that the state government of Bosnia represents both the citizens of Bosnia, comprised of the three constituent peoples and others, and the two entities. And this is very clear in the Dayton Constitution. The current minimalist government structure does not meet this requirement, as it provides an array of discriminatory prerogatives and protections to the constituent peoples and too few and often oblique rights and prerogatives to the entities and to citizens per se. This imbalance also contributes to the dysfunctionality and weakness of the state government in relation to the entities. Constitutional reform should therefore focus initially on increasing the direct role of the entities in the parliament through possibly the replacement of the House of Peoples with an entity-based upper house, thereby scaling back the compound protections granted to the constituent peoples. This change would have a knock-on effect of removing the need and argument for the discriminatory entity-based voting for the tripartite presidency. Let me be clear. I believe that both constituent peoples' rights and those of minorities must and should be protected and guaranteed at the state level. What needs to be reformed is the redundant institutional mechanisms by which they are protected, and here I would place greater emphasis on the role to be played by parliamentary rules procedures, which could be used to ensure proper constituent people and minority balances in both houses and in the Council of Ministers, and appropriate VNI vital national interest mechanisms in the House of Representatives and appeals to the Constitutional Court. With such reforms, it would then be possible to reintroduce and improve an upgraded set of constitutional amendments dealing with the state. To ensure more functional government for both domestic and EU integration purposes, the Council of Ministers' responsibilities could be enhanced at the expense of the presidency. Prior agreement by the entities on competencies would also open the door to negotiations on the appropriate number of state agencies and ministries necessary for the state to carry out its responsibilities both domestically and for purposes of EU integration. Such discussions will require agreement by both entities on the establishment of parallel institutions and agencies related to the agreed competencies to implement legislation by the state government, particularly as it relates to the EU integration. Finally, discussions on state responsibilities should also seek to reach agreement on a new EU-compliant human rights amendment to replace Article 2 of the Dayton Constitution. I think I've said enough to suggest that strong U.S. support for constitutional reform has the potential to break the political and constitutional gridlock that has perennially undermined Bosnia's sovereignty and stability and its prospects for successful European integration. The time for the EU has come for the EU to step forward and endorse constitutional reform. Time is of the essence. Put succinctly, if EU-US supported constitutional reform is not launched soon and brought to a successful conclusion over the next 10 to 12 months, Bosnia's slide toward political devolution might become irreversible. The consequences of that for the EU, Euro-Atlantic institutions, the region, and the long-suffering people of Bosnia are too dire to contemplate. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks to all of you for sort of covering a wide swath of land in terms of the various issues that the international community is working on in the region. I'll open it now to questions, and I hope that we can have a good discussion. Ioannis?
My question relates to visa facilitation. I'm asking this because from 2003 to 2006, we have been trying to get visa facilitation for professional drivers. So a very specific group. And we've gotten support from the European Commission, statements from the European Parliament. But the final decision rests with the Ministers of Interior. And I say this because in your presentation it sounded like this is something that is coming. It's a very positive step. It will provide a lot for the region, and we should expect it. And I'm extremely skeptical with that. I mean, I cannot, and that's my question, could you envision let me bring an example, the Minister of Interior of Italy supporting measures for lifting visa requirements for Albanians in the next 1 or 2 years?
This is a good question, which shows the tensions between the foreign policy ministers who are more supportive of the visa restriction, and then the Justice and Home Affairs ministers. But then in the Justice is the concrete measures, if they're taken, and the Justice and Home Affairs ministers agree that these measures are indeed implemented. This is possible because in the last improvement of the facilitation agreement, you have clear facilitation for business travelers, journalists, and students. So yeah, and especially in the case of Italy, as I mentioned, of the 8 foreign ministers, that are urging for the removal of the visa regime. One is Italy, the other Central European countries. Yeah, so even this is possible as long as the Justice and Home Affairs ministers are happy with the implementation. So that would be my response. They're tough, but once it's done, it's done.
Othon? I see your hand.
I've got a question for Sharon and Anthony. I'm just wondering to what degree there is a reevaluation of the long-term macroeconomic reform priorities. I mean, in many ways, isn't it also the mistake of the West and international organizations that now we've got so weak states and they are not able now to, confront this difficult economic situation by having pursued this aggressive privatization, liberalization? Now you don't have any more states in Eastern Europe to deal with this. So is there any kind of reconsideration what the role of the state should be? I mean, you yourself said, Sharon, that what is the success story now is a bit confusing. I mean, we don't know what is the success and what is not. So how is this going to affect the reform process, or this is not considered yet? I'm just trying to contain the crisis.
Well, I'm not sure these countries are doing so much worse. I mean, in fact, they handled the initial financial impact pretty well. The banks are well capitalized, and that is a direct result of really strong financial sector regulation that was pushed through by a government. Some of the key weaknesses, I mean, you can talk about the weaknesses in Bosnia on the pension system. I think that's not an issue of any policies pushed by the World Bank or the West. The government in Serbia, I think, has done a remarkable job coming off very difficult elections, coming off very challenging, difficult February of last year secession of Declaration of Independence of Kosovo, to continue to push forward on some key reforms, particularly on the pensions. They have a party, part of the coalition is called the Pensioners Party, that is holding that government together. So, and they've stood up pretty well to threats of, I think, overstated threats politically within the country. So I mean, I guess I don't see, other than Bosnia, which has its own unique situation, I don't see that the problem is weaknesses in governments based on any kind of, Serbia's doing pretty well, and they have pursued privatization. It's one of the faster, where they're having problems is in areas where they haven't privatized. So I mean, I don't think they went off on this binge of privatization and weakened everything. I think they've done pretty well. So I don't see it. I mean, I know this argument of the states are weaker because of not here, but in many parts of the world, and are now unable to confront this crisis. But I don't see it so clearly in these countries.
Just to add a little bit to what Anthony said, yeah, I would agree that privatization isn't the problem here. That actually the countries that have done a lot of privatization are pretty well off, especially when the strong Western firms have moved into the countries. Like I talked to someone from U.S. Steel a couple of months ago who said that their plant in Slovakia and probably their plant in Serbia as well, that they're really making every effort they can to keep employment at a certain level. So they're trying to be sensitive and cautious about the situation. Obviously, I don't think economic reforms can be taken separately from political reforms, and it is important to strengthen governments. But I mean, I think, like in the case of Bosnia with the veterans, Croatia has had similar problems. It's a difficult issue, and it remains to be seen how the governments will be able to deal with these kind of pressure groups.
There's also the issue of whether or not it's a realistic ideal to think that we can just switch off international intervention in any country around the world at this point in time. So that's something to keep into consideration. The other thing that I want to sort of throw out to the whole panel to think about, I know that Bruce addressed this very specifically, but what would a U.S. role be in the visa facilitation agenda, or on the anti-corruption agenda that the World Bank has and the EU would like to have in terms of, but doesn't perhaps, in terms of making the business climate nicer? I mean, this is something that over the last 8 years, it seems that the U.S. has sort of pulled back and waited for the EU to sort of take the lead. And we found out for various reasons in the first two sessions that there are many constraints working not only in the region, but also on the EU itself. And then issues that it has, and part of the conversation that we're trying to have too, of course, with this conference and with future endeavors is sort of strengthening the U.S.'s role. If we don't have to sort of fund the region, as Ioannis said, how does the U.S. policy support this? But let's take, if you think about that, let's take some more questions. I thought Bob and then Gulnur.
I have a question for Dr. Hitchner. Bruce, and without getting too technical, I assume that what you're saying is, or your proposal, your concept is based on the existing Constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is also Annex 4 of the Dayton Accords and was drafted by U.S. lawyers at Dayton, which is neither here nor there in the sense that it is what it is. As you know, my long-time objection to that Constitution has been the imbalance that is enshrined in it between individual rights and group rights, and which you address in your idea. But I'd be interested in what mechanism you foresee. How do we enable this? How do we operationalize it? And how do we inculcate a sense of urgency in both Washington and Brussels, not to mention the region, especially after the comments of our luncheon speaker? Thank you.
Well, let me just say that I think that our luncheon speaker did two things. First of all, Bosnia came first in the discussion. Secondly, the very first thing he mentioned in respect to Bosnia, apart from 5+2, was constitutional reform. I think that should be a clue that the United States is very much thinking about this whole issue right now, and that they are clearly focused on the issue of constitutional reform as an important issue, and I should also say so is the OHR. There is OHR EUSR. There is a view that, in fact, it is the crux of the matter, given the divergent political interests in the country. And so I don't really want to get into the modalities of how these things might be done, but I should say that many of the things that I alluded to were actually things that were agreed upon in the 2005-06 discussions privately, and actually did come out in, for example, the weakening of the powers of the presidency. There was also a recognition, the longer we went into the process, that in fact cleaning up the entities is critical, the Federation in particular at the moment, and that there was a genuine recognition that to some degree V&I had been overly protected. And in fact, it's fair to say that there's been a miscalculation on the part of the international community that V&I is in the House of Peoples, vital national interests, the idea of this notion of constituent peoples. In fact, vital national interests has been played out heavily in the House of Representatives. My sense, and I think I would contend that, in fact, constitutional reform is not nearly the intractable problem that a lot of people think it is. It is just that it has been very sporadically invested in, and that, in fact, permanent engagement in this, along with some other things. And I do believe that visa reform is important. I would also argue that, as with conflicts, internal political conflicts elsewhere in the world, it's absolutely critical to not have a process that's simply going at the elite state level, but also at civil society, business to business, people to people. The more we build up parallel processes that are essentially creating a common shared purpose, I think you can move forward. I think we really have to consider that Bosnia's only way forward is through a constitutional patriotism based on shared values, shared principles at this stage, and that if a country is to emerge fully, it will come from that. And in that sense, it does mirror to some degree more the early U.S. model rather than the purely nation-state model of Europe. That's my answer.
Gulnur, I saw it.
Thank you. My question are also to Bruce about constitutional reform. My first question is, how much do you think the Prude agreement or non-agreement, the fact that they decided to agree, was actually a breakthrough or not? Because I was personally quite confused by that. I didn't understand what Prude was all about at all. So if you can explain that to me, I'd be quite grateful. The second thing that came out from the workshops that we did was this individual sense of insecurity and alienation, and the sense that if I have to give up something to bolster state institutions or go forward towards Europe-Atlantic integration, will I be less secure than I am now? I think this was on the minds of every individual. And do you think that your proposal for bolstering the entities in constitutional reform is one way of overcoming this individual feeling of insecurity, of clinging on to things and not wanting to give up, and actually telling at the individual level that maybe you don't have to give up certain things? And my final question is something that I've been asking myself as well. How much of a state does Bosnia have to be to comply with EU conditions, and how much should the EU be involved in helping Bosnia get there? So I think it's really a question of measurement, but I'm just wondering how we go about measuring that. Thanks.
Well, the simplest answer to the last part of your question is it needs to be more than it is now, but not necessarily the same as some dirigist, very centralized state governments in Europe. I think much of the discussion now is that it's way too minimal. I mean, the truth is that I think there's been an enormous danger from the point of view of various states in Europe for a hugely weak federal structure to emerge in Bosnia. I can see regionalism popping up in lots of places in the rest of Europe if Bosnia is allowed to move forward as a small new state inside. And so I think that there is it's not that in principle such things are impossible, but there are certain now preconditions that I think making Bosnia's entry into Europe under an oversimplified, deeply federalized. This is not to say, for example, that, ministries couldn't be in different places in Sarajevo. I don't have any, I think that's an entirely possible solution. You could have some ministries in Mostar, some in Banja Luka, some in Tuzla, whatever. There are lots of ways to deal with that. But I think the notion that you can get away with a hugely weak central state inside working with the European Union is not plausible. Secondly, Prude. Prude was the three governing parties, okay? And one of the things that has always been central to this process is that in honoring a democratic process, however limited it might be, you have to work with the dominant, the dominant parties play an important role. That they came together with all the flaws, with all the uncertainties associated, was a good thing because of the interest that, even if it was brought together for something far less than altruistic intent, it had the effect of galvanizing them around certain concepts. Our view is that the prude parties, if they had gotten to a certain place, could have introduced a body of legislation which could then have been subsequently debated by all parties, and that if there was any set of parties that could put across legislation, because if you understand constitutional reform is ultimately a legislative process, as it says in the Dayton Constitution, it is probably the responsibility of the main parties in the government to do this. And therefore, the goal of supporting this was that perhaps they would come up with a viable package of legislation which then could be more publicly debated. They had no chance of getting 6 or 7 parties before. And so this was better than not having something happen at all. But we're under no illusions. We should be under no illusions that the process would have to involve everybody ultimately. Finally, I think that in terms of security and alienation, this is where the role of Europe, the EU, and the United States can be very, very important. One of the problems with constitutional reform done entirely without international intervention is that it's a lose-lose, it's a win-lose, I should say, for whoever puts things forward. For example, no one party in Bosnia could now put together a good plan, because even if everybody agreed with it, that would mean that party would gain in the election, the others would lose, and that would be a big problem. And so part of the reason why there needs to be some sort of mediation process by the international community is to provide them with cover, which would allow them to accept agreements from a third party, or at least accept mediation. And this is what people understand, is that it is still a zero-sum process, because the election structure in the country makes it impossible for the parties not to act in their own interest, which inside their own entities or within the entities. So part of the idea of building trust in the process is creating a sense of that confidence building. Let me give you one good example from the meetings. The RRS parties were quite willing to go to a single president and 2 vice presidents, and maybe in 4 years to a single president, if they could be assured that everybody would behave. The concern that each side has is that if you went to a single presidency right away, that party that held the presidency, or that constituent people, would manipulate the process, and they'd be powerless to stop it. And so what they are interested in is trust and confidence building. And this goes back to the issue then, thirdly, of the entities, is that, look, the entities are difficult, an ugly construction in many, many ways. There's no question about it. But they're here now. To eliminate them is to go back to something which no one would tolerate, instability and so forth. So the real question is say, okay, if we're going to accept them, which would give a lot of people peace and less anxiety, let's make sure we clean them up, eliminate the space in which they can do bad things. And hence, let's encourage the entities. But I don't think you can go to 3, because going to 3 would empower 1 way too much and might lead to the eventual disintegration of Bosnia. And I don't think anybody is ready for 5 just yet, even though that's potentially a very nice idea. But if you're talking about change, constitutional reform is a constantly evolving process. It doesn't end with one single set of negotiations. And so I would argue that all we're arguing for is you have to do one stage to get into the European Union process, and you have to make those changes, and that's why you have to focus at the state and entity level. Once you've done that, you can do lots of other things, if you agree.
John?
Yeah, John Lampe, Wilson Center, and University of Maryland, appreciating our comments here, and with 2 seconding remarks for Elena and Bruce, and then a question for Anthony, perhaps a delicate one, but I'm going to give it a try anyway. Seconding first the importance of the visa, at least the facilitation in Serbia in particular, that would be a lift that would help the EU connection process just all by itself. And as the educational process struggles with the Bologna process, at least moving around would help some. And I want to thank Bruce for showing that there can be constructive, precise proposals rather than just throwing up our hands, or the temptation on a certain American side to say, well, those entities have to go, and then we'll consolidate. There might even be a person or two in the American administration who'd like to do that. And then my friend Horace Sletzinger, who's all ready for 5 entities. He'll start with the Republika Srpska and cut it right down the middle, and then go on from there. But this can be done, and I wanted to second also your mention in the discussion of then ministries in different locations, because I think that's come up before.
It has.
And I really think that that would help, and I'd want to second the notion that can be done. And then finally for Anthony, since I was talking last week on the crucial importance, and Sharon Fisher recognizes this, and we've been back and forth on this, of showing that the European banks so predominant across the Western Balkans are going to stay the course. And the financial structures there help. Yes, that's one thing. Now we have something that's being referred to as the Vienna Initiative, and a gathering of 15 leading banks. Is it with the IMF and EBRD and so on in Vienna, and assuring that indeed the course will be stayed. I just wanted to inquire how, as people will certainly be inquiring in Serbia with the 3.9 billion IMF assistance coming. Is the 3.9 billion a TARP plan to go directly to these banks to then see that they will stay the course? Is that not the case, or and perhaps not the most delicate question, but I want to assure you that there are media in Belgrade that will be asking that question real fast.
Well, I mean, I actually had never thought of it.
Conspiracy.
I mean, they need money. They need money to on the external side, and they need money on the for massive fiscal deficits. Yeah, it's going to help them roll over some debts, some payments coming up. But I mean, I've looked at this Vienna initiative now that's moving to Brussels as really a way to. The big fear since the fall has been these parent banks are we're out of here. And that would have sent people running for the exits. It would have sent. I mean, there was a brief period of, a large number of depositors going and pulling their money out of the parent local banks. I think the commitment to, to stay and to stem that fear has been very well received. So I suppose in today's world, how can you not look at that kind of a commitment with the involvement of the involved banks and not see it that way? But first and foremost, we all saw it as a very, very important. It was important not just for that reason, but it was important to get the multilaterals to stay. I mean, to make a commitment. I talked a bit about the level of debt for some of these countries. The World Bank, over the last sort of 18 months, had developed a new exposure guidelines about very few people wanted to borrow from. Very few countries were borrowing from us. So we developed these exposure guidelines in a world of low demand. Things have changed over the last 4 or 5 months, and now everybody's coming back. Mexico's and Philippines and Brazil's, and so now there's a real rationing of capital. To get an extra $300 million for Serbia, which is a drop in the bucket. As you say, they have a €3 billion commitment from the fund. It took an enormous amount of gnashing of teeth. The fact that these banks have committed to stay, sort of is imprimatur of, these guys are doing the right thing in the financial sector again, in the banking system. So it was a very welcome is a signal of coordination that we haven't seen in some recent crises. So, but I'm sure we'll see. I'm sure we'll see that in the Serbian papers. And let me just say that this idea of many the ministries being put around Bosnia is a great idea. As long as there's they put in an airport in Banja Luka.
I agree. I couldn't agree more.
I saw a hand over here.
My name is Sletzinger. I'm a sociologist from Sofia University, currently based at the University of Maryland. My question is to Professor Hitchner. Let me draw parallels between Bosnia and Herzegovina and Cyprus. We remember that in 2004, the largest enlargement of the European Union, there was a plan Cyprus to be united, which plan failed mainly because Greek Cypriots voted against the plan, and as a result the European Union accepted only southern Greek part of the island. And my question is kind of provocative. Since we have precedent of Cyprus, do you think that there might be an option if the two entities of Bosnia and Herzegovina can't achieve the constitutional identity, the European Union to accept only one of them?
No. No, it's pretty simple. The repercussions are enormous in terms of where does it end? Does this affect other states in the region? Does it mean that treaties that are entered into by the major states involving the region are suddenly undone, and said if you just wait long enough you can undo them? The serious risk of what you might call massive policy failure on the part of the EU, the United States, European states in Bosnia, in a place. Cyprus is, after all, an island, and that does make a little bit of a difference. Bosnia is hardly an island, and the problem is that right now the situation in Bosnia is that everyone is aware that facts are being created on the ground, which could lead to a very difficult situation. And I think the reason why there is some urgency is that it is important to try to meet the spirit of what Dayton had tried to do, which was to produce a unified, functional Bosnia. That is still an important and laudable goal. And if you open the door at all to any of these other possibilities, everything that has been done since 1995 goes out the window. And I would argue that there are concerns about the way in which the process started that, for example, the breakup makes impossible. There are reasons that historically the creation, I mean, the truth is that I think it's very difficult to imagine either entity as having a legitimate claim to independence down the road as viable. And so these are the concerns. And I think the international community is sufficiently alive to the fact that right now that through inaction, through failure to resolve the tensions, there is a risk of, if not Cyprus, something like Cyprus. And inside Central and Eastern Europe and in Southeast Europe, that is a mortal threat to stability in the region. I think using the word mortal is not too inconsequential.
That's a question. Go ahead.
Did you want to ask?
Well, I have a question responding to your initial, but just to increase the kind of my naivete quotient a bit. Vice President Biden, I guess, is preparing for a trip to Bosnia in a few weeks. I'm sure there's a lot of people here who know the U.S. political situation better than I do. But what would be the impact of a high-level visit to Serbia of the U.S.? What are the possibilities of that, and what would be the effect of that in the region?
I think it, first of all, indicates clearly that the administration does consider it to be significant from the policy. As you might know, there had been some debate as to who was going to go. The decision to send the vice president is a signal of how important the United States views the region, and actually Bosnia in particular at the moment. And I think that, to be perfectly frank, I think they are concerned to arrest the erosion of the political situation in Bosnia. As you know, on a day-to-day basis, Bosnia can look stable. And you can check off a list of things that say, well, they're making progress. But in truth, the process is being put into place, a slow but inexorable process which has taken Bosnia down the road to effectively two very autonomous sub-states who, for all intents and purposes, are moving for a variety of reasons towards a destabilizing situation. The administration does not want to see this occur, and will make that point.
Sorry, but I'm just wondering about the possible salutary effect of a similar visit to the neighbor in Belgrade.
I believe that's on order.
It's on order.
I believe that's on order. The list is still being made, the list of countries, but I believe that is, and it's going to be a strong visit.
Can I have Susan before we go back to you?
Just on this.
Oh, okay. One more small observation.
Sorry, but it's time to say that if either Vice President Biden or Secretary of State Clinton that are perceived in Belgrade as bound so very closely to the decisions that were taken in the mid-1990s is the primary U.S. representative, then I would worry a lot about the counterproductive effect. And the Belgrade media that I just mentioned is already getting ready to welcome Vice President Biden. But there's really only one alternative, and he's busy.
Suze.
Sue Summers, former Wilson public policy scholar. A question for Dr. Hitchner. Can you comment on what the view is of the present constitutional court personnel? And I know that it includes a foreigner, at least one, built in through the Dayton Constitution. If the institutions are in fact rebuilt through a constitutional reform, will the emphasis now be on strictly nationals of BH handling their own institutions, or is there some perception that there must be a continued insinuation of the internationals in the actual institutions, not as advisors, but as part of the institutions?
That will go away in due course. I think the issue has to do with the prosecutors for the war crimes, the local issues. That is the concern that now exists within the international community about letting go of any international presence. And because, for example, on the recent issues of corruption that have emanated out of Banja Luka, part of the problem was that there was some intimidation of the prosecutor. And there's a fear that right now we don't have a sufficiently strong judiciary in Bosnia to the rule of law is not sufficiently embedded. But the goal is to definitely turn it over. It's a question of whether there should be a renewal at the end of the year. And as you know, for example, it's supposed to run out in December 2009. And the international presence has been reduced, consistently reduced, and that a number of the parties have expressed their interest in eliminating it altogether at this stage. Well, what we have to do is understand that that can't be done until there's the perception that the courts are abiding by the rule of law and are not being overly intimidated, okay, in the process, and ways that would suggest that if there was any no international presence, it would die. So, yes, I don't think anybody in the international community wants to stay 1 second longer. But once they go, and here's the rub with Dayton. Let me just point out, is that the challenge that the EU faces in, let's say, the end of the Dayton process isn't so much that the Dayton process needs to be overly active as much as that it presents a legal basis for staying, to making sure that the international community come back in if things go bad. It's really difficult if you walk away from, you say the Dayton mission is over. It's over. A lot of people signed that agreement. And the day that's said to be finished, they can walk away from that agreement and all that it requires them to do, whether it's in the OSCE, whether it's in other elements of the thing. And so the great fear is not so much that the international community wants to remain active vis-a-vis the OHR in a lot of things and wants to stay in, but until Bosnia is perceived as not being potentially going down the road of breaking apart, the international community wants the legal ability to step back in. That's the tension. And all the parties need to recognize in Bosnia is that that is the key prerequisite for leaving. Some sense of stability and the rule of law being there. Not everybody realizes corruption's not going to go away and certain types of things. But the outcome of this particular case is potentially the breakup of the country.
Would that include, though, the Constitutional Court, which is a separate provision under Dayton, not...
Well, the Constitutional Court, everybody has agreed that the Constitutional Court has to be revisited. There is some need to do that, and that's actually under discussion. Yes.
Part two was, is it viewed that there's a severability to the various provisions of Dayton? In other words, is a revisiting of the constitutional issues. Is there any movement afoot to revisit other provisions of Dayton?
Let's put it this way. If you change the Dayton Constitution, you change a lot of things as well that have come under the umbrella of Dayton. One of the things that people don't realize is that actually even if the April reforms had been implemented, that would have actually changed about 60% of the entire Constitution, and it would have had a knock-on effect on various annexes to the Dayton Agreement. This is the other part of it, is that people do not fully come to grips with the fact that constitutional reform is a narrow process. It has a big effect, and that you don't need to throw away Dayton to make a lot of changes. There would be a lot of changes if even the most simple reforms go through. The other thing that's worth pointing out is what we're not addressing here is that it is not enough to sign an agreement. It has to be implemented. And the cost and what that means is the creation of agencies, ministries, trained professionals, and this is what nobody is facing up to. That in fact, Bosnia, you could sign a constitutional reform agreement tomorrow, but there needs to be ministries and agencies that function and work and can deal with the EU. So first of all, you don't even have the proper institutions and structures. You don't have them. Secondly, you'd have to find the money and the resources and the training to make those things actually work for the EU. Nobody addresses this. Everybody's out to lunch. It's like sign an agreement, we move on. Sign an agreement, we move on. We have to realize that we have not created sufficient institutions. You know, you can't be a state, you can't surrender your sovereignty before you have your sovereignty. You have to be a state to be in the European Union, and Bosnia is not yet a functioning state.
We have 3 more questions. I saw Milica first, and then Ioannis, and then Wade.
Well, first, I wanted to comment on the visa facilitation regime. It's not by it's not a coincidence that Italy is among the countries supporting this initiative, precisely because Mr. Frattini, who is now the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Italy, used to be the commissioner who was directly in charge of visas. So perhaps he's more aware of the readiness, perhaps, of the countries to be able to get the visa, to get on the white Schengen list. I actually wanted to comment on the economic issues. Partly, John Lampe stole my question, but the reason why it's so urgent to really accelerate the process of integration of the Western Balkan countries into the European Union is precisely because the crisis is going to have a very, very serious impact. This was not obvious only 4 months ago, but it's becoming more and more obvious. If we look at the latest forecast for GDP fall, for example, for Serbia, which are likely to be even -6%, and one of the most critical issues, which in fact we had the opportunity to discuss also here at the Woodrow Wilson Center is the banking sector. The banking sector in all the Western Balkan countries except Macedonia is owned by the Western banks. From 70 to 90% of banking assets today in all the countries except Macedonia, the share is a bit lower, is in the hands of EU banks, of international banks, EU countries. And of course, now that the IMF is back, it's back in Serbia, but it's likely to be back also in some other countries. The real question is the vulnerability of the banking sector, precisely because there may be bad loans, a quantity of bad loans much higher than has been recognized or said openly until now. Of course, the Vienna Initiative is extremely important. It's extremely important, but that it has been done, but it's been done with the mediation of the IFIs. So the IFIs are asking the banks not to pull out of the region. So somehow, I would say, ironically, perhaps part of these packages that the IMF is offering to some of these countries is actually going to be spent for bailing out subsidiaries of EU banks, which ultimately will have to be paid by the countries themselves, obviously. So somehow I think that the situation is far worse than seemed just a few months ago, and therefore I think that there should be more support of the countries and acceleration of the whole process.
Any comments from here? We can take more questions.
I don't have anything to add.
We can take more. Yeah.
I agree too.
Ioannis?
I would like to go back to the possible visit by Vice President Biden to Serbia, because I want to say I really disagree with your statement. Either Secretary Clinton or Vice President Biden, I think, will show up in Belgrade, and it will be a huge step. It will be very welcome. I think the average Serb wants to turn a page. All this posturing about them looking to Russia, I think it's totally fake. The average Serb is closer to the West than ever to Russia, irrelevant of the Orthodoxy stuff and the Slavic Brotherhood stuff. My biggest concern is not Belgrade, is Washington, in the sense. Because I've been participating for the last 2 or 3 months in a lot of similar conferences, and I see just a lot of people have made a career in this city out of Serb busing. And it keeps going on and going on. 3 weeks ago, we were at CSIS, many of us in this room. The number one topic discussed for half an hour was General Mladic. And I find it amazing. So I would think the bigger cost for someone like Secretary Clinton and Vice President Biden, and the bigger problem they would face is back home and not in Belgrade. Thanks.
Wade?
This is mostly to Sharon, I guess, wanting you to say a bit more about the reforms you'd like to see in the region. I mean, when I look at the reforms, a couple of years ago, if you made a list of things, you would say some general Washington consensus kinds of things. You would talk about austerity, and you would probably talk about corruption. And it seems to me that it's a little harder to draw the list up right now. The Washington consensus is looking pretty ragged in many parts of the world, and people are less sure, including in Central and Eastern Europe, exactly what that bought. Some of the best performers have been the most liberal. Some of the worst performers have been the most liberal. Some pretty good performers have been fairly social democratic, Slovenia, for example. So it's a complicated picture there. On the austerity side, everybody has pretty grave doubts about telling people to cut public spending in a time of generally deflationary movement. And so even the IMF is saying, well, our conditions are going to look a little bit different now. We want to make sure that we make a contribution to sustaining aggregate demand. And so all of a sudden, people are starting to sound a lot more neo-Keynesian, to put it bluntly. And that leaves corruption. And so and business-friendly environment more generally. And so could you say a bit more about that category? Because that seems to be the place where was closest to your heart in the presentation, and the one that, at least to me, makes the most sense. But what are the details that you had in mind there?
Well, I mean, I didn't necessarily think of any details. I mean, if you look at these indices, then you can see, I mean, there are detailed breakdowns by different subjects, like how many days it takes to start a business in a given country and these kinds of things. And it's very clearly laid out, and all of the countries are ranked by these different criteria. So these are reforms that are relatively easy, and they don't cost a lot of money to implement. So when you're talking about a situation with very serious budgetary limitations, these kinds of business-friendly reforms are pretty easy to push forward and quite effective. Obviously, as you pointed out, there are big differences in the impact. And I think that the countries that have suffered the most, the countries from Central and Eastern Europe that have suffered the most in the current crisis are those that had like large current account deficits and a lot of foreign borrowing and a lot of consumer debt in foreign currencies. And these are problems that they didn't have much to do with the liberal business environment. I mean, things just got out of hand, and for transition countries such as the Western Balkans, I think it's really important that governments keep an eye on these things. And like we've seen huge current account deficits in the Western Balkans for a number of years now, and the governments should have taken steps to do something about them when they did have strong growth. I mean, now it's going to be extra painful to make any kind of changes. And just to follow up on Nida's question and on Ioannis's point about Serb bashing, I remember I was at a meeting like maybe a year and a half ago, and I talked to someone from this State Department who was in charge of Balkan policy, and I asked, he was really pushing for Kosovo independence, and I asked what the U.S. was going to do for Serbia, like, as a trade-off, and he said absolutely nothing. It's the EU's problem, which I thought was quite arrogant. I don't think that necessarily the U.S. is full of Serb bashers. I mean, there are plenty of people who are willing to do something to help. I think more does need to be done. And just to follow up on what Nida's question, one of the obvious steps is to work more closely with the EU and international institutions to forge common reform priorities. I think in recent years you've seen like different priorities stressed by different actors, and this creates confusion and problems in the countries. And one thing that was very effective in the Slovak case, which I know very well, is and sending expert advisors. And I have a couple of Slovak friends who were trained in the West, and like one worked at the World Bank for many years, and one was trained at Harvard and worked at the IMF for a brief time, and they both got jobs at Slovak ministries during the 8 years when the Tsorbatzoglou government was in power, when they did a lot of reforms, and they got World Bank funding actually to work as expert advisors to various ministries, and working together with other reform-oriented people, they really managed to do a lot of things and push forward a lot of legislation that might not have otherwise happened. And I mean, it's important in that case that these were local people who were already connected in society, and they weren't just foreigners who were thrown into the situation to give advice. I think it can be much more effective if you find local people that you can trust and work with, and give them an incentive, because these people wouldn't have gone to Slovakia just out of the goodness of their heart and work on some ministry wage, which was very low at the time and probably still is. But it was a quite effective program.
Did you want to add something about that?
To John Lempe, indeed, and to the idea of people-to-people communication, the Erasmus program that encouraged student mobility in European Union has been very successful, and this mingling of young people is now even more acknowledged in vis-a-vis relations with the Western Balkans, because the latest document that came in relation with the improving the road to visa liberalization from April notes that there will be a doubling of the number of scholarships for students from the Western Balkans in the academic year 2009-2010, and the annual sum of 20 million euro will be enable several hundred additional students to benefit from experience of studying in the EU.
That actually brings up a really important point. There's probably more people in the Federation going to Europe and the RS going to Europe than they're going to each entity. And that's the real problem, is that there is if you think about what's the primary problem is that people in both entities are increasingly below the level of the politicians, not engaging with one another less and less and less. And so it's great if we send them off to Europe, but if we send them off as separate entities all the time and they're not talking to one another, it doesn't help. That's why, and so I agree, this is an important thing, but there's not much communication going on between high school students in Banja Luka, say, and in Sarajevo, or in Tuzla and other cities. That's the problem.
That's it. And the question that you had about the U.S. role, I'm not sure what it could be, but right now the countries from the previous enlargement are negotiating for visa-free travel to the U.S., and only Slovenia can travel for free. And within context, I think the U.S. is now engaged into policy towards the Central European countries who feel isolated vis-a-vis the U.S. And I think in general the U.S. interest could be in terms of discussing or being interested in what measures the European Union takes in order to make sure that there are no security threats from these countries that might be relevant not only for the European Union, because they may as well come to the U.S. So this is how I see the connection.